The stone weighs 50 tons, not a mountain, not a cliff face, a single carved pillar shaped by human hands dragged across uneven limestone ground and set upright on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey 11,000 years ago. The people who moved it had no metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals. What they had apparently was intention and some knowledge of how to act on it at a scale that should not have been possible. Göbekli Tepe does not ask to be impressive. It simply stands and waits for the question that always follows. How did hunter-gatherers living in small mobile bands build something like this before the first farm was ever planted? Tonight we follow that question across 3 layers. We'll move through the physical traces left in the limestone, the carvings, the circular enclosures, the deliberate burial of structures the builders clearly considered worth preserving. We'll examine the theory that a British journalist named Graham Hancock has spent 3 decades constructing that Göbekli Tepe is not a beginning but an echo, a fingerprint of a lost civilization that flourished during the last ice age and was nearly erased by a cosmic catastrophe. And we'll sit quietly with the counter-arguments, the careful work of archaeologists who have spent years in those trenches and who offer a very different reading of the same stones. We are not here to settle the debate. Some of these questions carry no settled answer yet. That is part of what makes them worth following into the quiet. The hilltop where Göbekli Tepe stands rises above the Germish Mountains in southeastern Turkey, roughly 10 miles northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa. 11,000 years ago, the plain below was different, lush, watered, alive with migrating herds of gazelle and wild cattle moving through stands of wild wheat. It was by most measures a good place to live, and yet no one lived here not permanently. The site shows no cooking hearths left by families, no refuse pits accumulating the quiet debris of daily life, no sleeping structures. The people who built Göbekli Tepe came for something other than shelter, and when they were finished, or when that something was complete, they buried what they had made, deliberately, carefully, with tons of rubble and fill preserving the pillars beneath the earth, as if they understood that what stood here needed to outlast everything around it. That deliberate burial is one of the site's stranger details. Structures built over centuries then interred, new enclosures raised on top of the old ones. The pattern repeated across at least 1,300 years of intermittent use. And here is what gives that strangeness some weight. Less than 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated so far. The rest, more enclosures, more pillars, more carvings, still lies beneath the surface. What remains underground may one day reframe the theories that surround this place, or it may confirm what careful archaeologists have been arguing for years. Either way, the majority of this site is still waiting. It was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt who first recognised what this hilltop held in 1994. He had spent years working at a related site called Nevelachori, where similar T-shaped limestone pillars had been uncovered before a rising dam flooded the valley. When Schmidt walked across this particular tell and examined what earlier surveyors had dismissed as medieval grave markers, he saw something different. The distinctive T-shape, the worked surfaces, the density of deliberately shaped stone, far too great for a simple burial ground. Excavations began the following year. By the time Schmidt died in 2014, Göbekli Tepe had already altered archaeology's understanding of when monumental construction begins and what drives it. The mainstream interpretation that emerged from those decades of careful work is itself remarkable entirely on its own terms. Hunter-gatherers, people not yet farming, not yet settled in permanent villages, organised themselves to quarry and move limestone pillars weighing up to 50 tons to carve their surfaces, with images of foxes, scorpions, vultures, wild boar and oryx, and to erect them in precisely planned circular enclosures on a remote hilltop. The sequence that had long anchored our understanding of early civilization agriculture, first, then settlement, then temples, does not hold here. Klaus Schmidt said it plainly: first came the temple, then the city. That inversion is by itself enough to occupy a long night of thought. It suggests that the impulse to create sacred space to build something that reaches past practical need may be older and more fundamental than we assumed, but Graham Hancock looks at the same stones and sees something the excavation reports do not address to his satisfaction. He sees a level of coordination, symbolic depth, and apparent astronomical knowledge that suggests in his reading the fingerprints of an older tradition. Knowledge that arrived from somewhere else, carried perhaps by survivors of a civilization undone by the event geologists call the younger dryas, a sudden catastrophic cooling that struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago and lasted for over 1,000 years. Some researchers have proposed the trigger was not a gradual shift in ocean circulation, but a comet or fragments of one striking the ice sheets of North America. That hypothesis remains contested. What is not contested is that the world changed abruptly and that Göbekli Tepe was built in the immediate aftermath of that change. Somewhere within Enclosure D on a limestone surface designated Pillar 43, the one that has come to be known as the vulture stone, Hancock believes he can read something encoded in the arrangement of carved animals and symbols, a date, a calculation and a warning that points not only backward 11,000 years but forward, toward our own era. Whether that reading is archaeology or imagination or something in between that we do not yet have a clean word for is a question we will hold carefully tonight, turning it slowly without pressing it toward a resolution it may not yet have earned. So we begin with the stones themselves, with what they weigh and how they were shaped and what is carved into their surfaces in the limestone dark of a hilltop that no one for 30 years thought to look at twice. The first trace starts here, the hill that should not exist. In the autumn of 1994, a German archaeologist crouched on a limestone plateau in southeastern Turkey and picked up a fragment of worked stone. The wind off the Gurmush Mountains was dry and thin. Around him, the ground sloped gently downward in all directions, giving a clear view of the Harran Plain, far below a wide, pale expanse that in summer turns the colour of the old paper. The fragment in his hand was not unusual at first glance. Broken limestone appears across this entire region. What made Klaus Schmidt pause was the surface. It had been pecked smooth, deliberately, with patience, and the shape of the break suggested something larger, a profile he'd seen before at another site 20 miles to the south before a dam swallowed it. He set the fragment down. Then he looked at the hill more carefully. What Schmidt was standing on was an artificial mound formed by centuries of accumulated human activity, so one layer pressed down upon the last. Tells exist across the Middle East silent records of repeated occupation, each stratum a kind of compressed time. This one locals called Göbekli Tepe Potbelly Hill for the rounded swell of its shape. Shepherds had grazed flocks across it for generations. An archaeological survey team from the University of Chicago had visited in 1963 and filed a report that described the broken stone slabs as probable medieval grave markers, a Byzantine cemetery, nothing worth a closer look, and for 30 years that judgment stood. That is where the quiet problem begins, not with what was found, but with how long it was not looked for. Schmidt returned the following year with a team and began to excavate. What emerged from the earth over the seasons that followed was not a cemetery. It was a complex of circular stone enclosures, each formed by a ring of T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 16 feet tall, set into precisely carved stone sockets in the ground. At the centre of each enclosure, two larger pillars faced one another, the tallest of these reaching heights that would require modern lifting equipment to replicate comfortably. The stones had been quarried from the plateau itself. Ancient quarries are still visible a few hundred yards from the main excavation, and in those quarries unfinished pillars remain partially attached to the bedrock abandoned mid-creation for reasons no record explains. The site is called Pre-Pottery Neolithic. That label matters. It means the people who built Göbekli Tepe had not yet developed ceramic vessels. They were not yet farming in any organised sense. They were hunter-gatherers, people who followed the seasonal movements of game, who gathered wild wheat and barley and pistachio, who lived in small mobile groups and left behind the kind of archaeological traces that blend quietly into the landscape. According to the model that governed thinking about human prehistory for most of the 20th century, people like this did not build things like this, monumental architecture, the kind that requires quarrying engineering. Coordinated labour over years or decades was supposed to be a product of settled life. You needed agriculture first, then villages, then surplus, then specialisation, then temples. That was the sequence. It held for a long time because nothing had yet appeared to seriously challenge it. Göbekli Tepe challenged it, directly and without apology. The numbers that emerge from the excavation are on their own enough to hold the attention for a moment. More than 100,000 animal bone fragments have been recovered from the site, predominantly gazelle, followed by wild cattle, wild boar and red deer. The bones show clear evidence of butchering cut marks marrow. Marrow extraction, the particular fracture patterns left by stone tools working through dense tissue. Alongside the bones, archaeologists found more than 7,000 grinding stones, flat limestone surfaces, and handheld grinders used to process wild cereals into something edible. The picture that forms from these two data sets together is not of permanent residents eating daily meals. It is of gatherings, large, periodic, possibly seasonal feasts, drawing people from distances that may have stretched 50 or even 100 miles across the plain. That detail refuses to go away. The grinding stones, 7,000 of them. Wild grain being processed at scale by people who had not yet planted a seed. It suggests something hovering at a threshold, not quite agriculture, not quite the old forager pattern either. A population already intimately familiar with wild cereals, already processing them in large quantities, already organised enough to converge repeatedly on a single hilltop and feed hundreds of people while simultaneously quarrying and erecting 50-ton pillars. The tools used to do all of this were flint. Stone knapping debris found across the site confirms that every cut, every smoothed surface, every carved relief was produced by hand tools made from locally sourced flint. No metal, no wheels, no animals trained to pull weight, and yet the structures stand, several of them layered one atop another, spanning at least 1,300 years of construction and use, built by people the old model had categorized as too simple, too scattered, too resource constrained to organize at this scale. Klaus Schmidt would spend the remaining 20 years of his life excavating this hill. He died in Hull in 2014, with less than 5% of the site uncovered. The enclosures archaeologists have designated A, B, C, and D represent only the surface of what geophysical surveys suggest lies beneath dozens more structures, more pillars, more carved stone, more questions pressed into the limestone and waiting. What was this place for? That question opens in several directions, and the directions do not all lead to the same answer. We follow the first one now down into the stone itself, into the surface of the pillars, where something was clearly being said. What the stones were saying. At some point during the construction of the enclosures, a carver sat before a limestone surface and began to work an image into the stone. The tools available were flint hard sharp edged, capable of fine detail when used with patience, and the Vagina's technique was percussion and abrasion, a process of pecking at the surface to remove material in controlled increments, then grinding the result smooth. It was slow work, the kind of work that requires returning to the same spot across many sessions, stepping back, reassessing, returning again. What emerged from that process, repeated across dozens of pillars spanning more than a millennium of construction, was not random. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe form a visual language, not arbitrary decoration scattered across available stone, but a consistent, deliberate, and surprisingly varied repertoire of imagery that archaeologists are still working to understand. Animals dominate. That much is clear. But the specific animals chosen and the care with which they are rendered suggest something beyond simple decoration or hunting record. Foxes appear frequently bushy-tailed, recognizable, depicted with attention to the texture of fur, suggested through fine surface pecking. Foxes are not major prey animals. They yield little meat compared to the gazelle, whose bones fill the site's refuse layers, or the wild cattle whose size would have made a successful hunt a communal celebration. Their prominence on the pillars is therefore curious, and it has led some researchers to propose that the fox held a symbolic or totemic role for the communities that use this site, a clan marker perhaps, or an animal associated with particular ritual functions. The evidence for any specific interpretation is thin, but the repetition is real. Whatever the fox meant to the carvers, it meant enough to place it repeatedly in stone. Snakes appear too, their bodies rendered in sinuous curves that follow the contours of the limestone surface, their scales sometimes indicated by fine cross-hatching or parallel incisions. In many later cultures across this region and beyond, the snake carries layered meaning, underworld transformation, danger, renewal. The shedding of old skin as a symbol of cyclical change. Whether the builders of Göbekli Tepe understood snakes through any similar symbolic framework cannot be known. Their worldview is not recorded anywhere in writing because writing did not exist. What can be said is that snakes appear on pillars across multiple enclosures, suggesting they held a place in whatever system of meaning organised the carvings as a whole. Wild boar appear, mid-charged tusks prominent, the musculature of the animal's neck and shoulder suggested through careful surface modelling. Hunting a boar was dangerous. Fastinosaurus capable of the decision to depict them with such attention to their power and force suggests at minimum an awareness of what it meant to face one and possibly something more, some acknowledgement of the animal as an adversary worthy of being recorded in permanent stone. Then there are the birds. Vultures appear on several pillars in forms that are immediately recognisable long neck hunched posture, the distinctive silhouette of a bird built for processing carrion rather than hunting live prey. At a later Neolithic site called Chat Hoyuk, located several hundred miles to the west and occupied roughly 2,000 years after Göbekli Tepe's earliest enclosures, archaeologists found evidence of excarnation, the practice of exposing the dead to vultures before collecting the cleaned bones for secondary burial. Wall paintings at that site depict vultures interacting with headless human figures in ways that seem clearly ritualistic. Whether the same practice or belief system existed at Göbekli Tepe is unconfirmed. No primary burial sites have been identified at the hill itself, but the prominent depiction of vultures combined with the headless human figures that appear on at least one pillar has led many researchers to suspect some continuity of belief between these two sites separated by millennia. The detail is small, but it refuses to go away. Cranes appear in flight. Scorpions crawl across stone surfaces, their segmented bodies and curved tails rendered with precision that suggests the carvers were working from direct observation rather than memory or convention. Oryx are depicted with the particular elegance of an animal built for speed, and across several pillars carved in a bas-relief on the narrow lateral faces of the T-shaped stones are what appear to be human arms bent at the elbow, hands positioned at the waist or chest, rendered in a way that transforms the pillar itself into something almost figural. The T-shape which gave these pillars their name in the archaeological literature suddenly reads differently when you notice the arms. The broad horizontal top becomes a head, or at least a suggestion of one. The pillar is not just a structural element. It is or resembles a being stylized, abstracted, but unmistakably suggesting human form. Klaus Schmidt described them as frozen beings, neither quite human nor quite architectural. Standing eternal watch, he said, which may be as close as language can come to capturing what they feel like in person. Scattered among the figurative carvings are abstract symbols, H-shaped markings that appear on multiple pillars across different enclosures, crescent circles and parallel lines whose meaning remains genuinely opaque. These abstract elements are in some ways the most provocative of all the imagery at Göbekli Tepe, because they imply a kind of symbolic thought that goes beyond representation. An image of a fox depicts a fox. An H-shaped mark depicts nothing in the natural world. It refers to a concept, a category, a meaning that existed entirely within a shared human mental framework, a sign system, however simple, in which visual marks stood for ideas rather than objects. The existence of such marks 11,000 years ago suggests that the cognitive architecture for symbolic language was in place long before writing, long before agriculture, long before any of the cultural developments we tend to associate with the emergence of complex human thought. The full repertoire of carvings at Göbekli Tepe has not yet been catalogued. Less than 5% of the site is excavated. The pillars that have been uncovered represent only a fraction of what likely exists beneath the surface, and each new enclosure revealed by excavation has produced imagery that both confirms the overall visual language of the site and introduces new elements that complicate any single interpretive framework. What the carvings meant collectively, individually, in their specific arrangements within specific enclosures remains one of the site's central unsolved questions. But one pillar standing in the northwestern section of Enclosure D has attracted more attention than any other. Its carvings are more complex, more densely composed, and more specifically arranged than most of what surrounds it. Archaeologists designated it Pillar 43. Others began calling it something else, a name drawn from the most prominent figure carved into its face, a large bird with wings spread wide dominating the upper portion of the stone, the vulture stone. and what some researchers believe is written on it has very little to do with birds. The vulture stone. Consider what it means to carve a warning into stone when you have no alphabet, no numbering system, no shared written convention that will survive you. The message cannot be verbal. It cannot be annotated, labelled, or explained in any language that will still be readable 1,000 years later, let alone 10,000. If you wanted to encode something permanent, something that a future civilization might one day be sophisticated enough to decode, you would have to use a medium that transcends language entirely. You would have to use the sky. Pillar 43 stands in the northwestern section of Enclosure D, one of the 4 major circular structures excavated so far at Göbekli Tepe. Like the other pillars at the site, it is T-shaped, carved from the local limestone and set into a carefully prepared socket in the stone floor. But its surface is unusually dense with imagery more compositionally deliberate than most of what surrounds it. The figures arranged not in loose scatter, but in a scene, a specific configuration that carries the feeling of intention rather than accumulation. At the top of the pillar, dominating its face, is a large bird rendered with wings outstretched, its body positioned horizontally above a curved boundary line. Directly below that line sits a scorpion, its claws forward and its tail arched. To the sides of the composition are smaller birds, a snake, and what appears to be a headless human figure, with notably an erect phallus, a detail that complicates straightforward interpretations of catastrophe or death, and which different researchers have read in radically different ways. At the centre of the upper composition, positioned just above the large bird's left wing, is a simple circular disc, smooth and unadorned, carved into the stone. That circle is where the most contested interpretation of Göbekli Tepe begins. For the first years after Schmidt's excavations brought Pillar 43 to light, the mainstream reading of the composition was primarily funerary or mythological. The vulture, because that is what most researchers identified the large bird as, given its posture and the regional context of excarnation practices, was associated with death, with the transition between life and what comes after it. The headless human figure seemed to reinforce this. The scorpion, a creature of hidden places and nocturnal habits, had symbolic resonance across many ancient cultures of the Near East. The pillar in this reading was depicting a scene from a belief system, a mythological narrative about death and perhaps rebirth, rendered in stone by people for whom these images carried meaning, within a shared cultural framework that we can no longer fully access. This interpretation is cautious, internally consistent, and supported by comparison with other Neolithic sites in the region. It does not require anything extraordinary, and for many archaeologists that is precisely what recommends it. Then Paul Burley looked at the same stone from a different angle. Burley was not an archaeologist, he was an independent researcher working from photographs and published reports, when he noticed something that struck him as more than coincidental. The large bird on Pillar 43 bore a compositional resemblance to the constellation Sagittarius, not the modern archer figure familiar from Western astronomical tradition, but the older bird-associated interpretation of the same star grouping used in certain ancient Near Eastern contexts. Sitting adjacent to Sagittarius along the path of the Milky Way is Scorpius, and the scorpion on Pillar 43 sits in roughly the same positional relationship to the bird above it, as Scorpius sits to Sagittarius in the night sky. The circular disc above the bird's wing Burley proposed might represent the sun, and if the disc represented the sun and the bird and scorpion represented constellations, then the composition as a whole might be doing something very specific, recording the position of the sun against the background of stars at a particular moment in time. This is where the detail becomes technically precise in a way that is difficult to simply dismiss. The positions of constellations as seen from Earth do not remain fixed over long periods of time, because Earth's axis wobbles slowly, completing one full cycle of precession approximately every 26,000 years. The background of stars against which the sun rises and sets at any given point in the calendar year shifts gradually over millennia. This means that the astronomical configuration depicted on any given carving, if the carving is accurately representing a real sky, can in principle be matched to a specific date by working backward through the mathematics of precession. When researcher Martin Sweatman applied this calculation to Burley's proposed reading of Pillar 43, the configuration he arrived at pointed to a date of approximately 10,950 BC, give or take roughly 250 years. That date sits at the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. It coincides within the margin of uncertainty with the proposed timing of the comet impact that some researchers believe triggered one of the most abrupt climate catastrophes in human prehistory. Some researchers argue this alignment is coincidental, that matching animal carvings to constellations requires assumptions about ancient star groupings that cannot be verified, and that the mathematics of precession can be made to produce almost any desired date depending on which elements of the image you choose to emphasize. That is a serious objection, and it deserves to sit with us for a moment rather than be moved past quickly. The night sky contains enough stars that almost any arrangement of figures can be made to correspond to some configuration at some point in time, and the human mind is extraordinarily good at finding patterns it is already looking for. These are genuine methodological concerns, not small ones. And yet the scorpion is very specifically placed. The circle is very specifically positioned. The calculation was not performed by Hancock himself, but by an independent researcher, applying standard astronomical software to a proposed star map. Whether that map is what the carvers intended remains the question, and it is a question that the stone itself cannot answer, because the people who made it left no annotation, no key, no explanation in any medium that has survived. Graham Hancock encountered Burley's work and recognised in it the shape of something he had been building toward for years, a connection between ancient monuments encoded astronomical knowledge and a catastrophe so severe it had nearly erased a civilization from the record of the world. That civilization and the event that may have destroyed it is where we go next. The world that ended before history began. One date sits in the geological record like a fault line running beneath everything built above it. Approximately 12,800 years ago, in the span of what ice core evidence suggests may have been as little as a few decades, possibly less, average temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. In practical terms, that is the difference between a temperate woodland and a near-glacial landscape. Rivers that had been flowing year-round began to freeze, growing seasons that had been lengthening, as the last ice age slowly retreated, suddenly contracted again. Vegetation zones shifted southward. Animal populations that had been expanding into newly habitable territory found that territory becoming uninhabitable again, with a speed that gave little time for adaptation. The warming trend that had been gently reshaping the world for thousands of years reversed itself in what amounts in geological time to an instant. Scientists named this period the Younger Dryas, after a small flowering plant, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears suddenly and abundantly in sediment cores from this era across Europe. A cold-adapted species expanding into regions where it had no business thriving. The plant became an unwitting timestamp for one of the most abrupt climate events in the last 20,000 years. The standard geological explanation for what caused the Younger Dryas centers on ocean circulation. As the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered much of North America during the last ice age, began melting, it released enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic. Fresh water is less dense than salt water. When it flooded into the ocean in sufficient quantity, it disrupted the delicate balance of salinity and temperature that drives the Atlantic meridional, overturning circulation, the system of deep water currents that moves warm tropical water northward and keeps the climate of the North Atlantic region significantly milder than its latitude would otherwise allow. When that circulation slowed or stalled, the warmth it delivered northward ceased. Temperatures plummeted. The cold persisted for approximately 1,200 years before the circulation gradually resumed and the world warmed again into the stable, relatively mild conditions of the Holocene, the geological epoch we still inhabit today. This explanation is well supported by multiple independent lines of evidence, internally coherent and widely accepted within the geological community. It does not require anything unusual. And then in 2007, a research team led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that proposed something considerably more dramatic. Firestone and his colleagues argued that the Younger Dryas was not triggered by meltwater dynamics alone, but by the impact or multiple impacts of a fragmenting comet striking the Earth at the onset of the cold period. The evidence they presented was physical and specific nanodiamonds found in sediment layers dating precisely to the beginning of the Younger Dryas, tiny crystalline structures that form only under the extreme pressures produced by impacts or explosions, and which have no known natural terrestrial origin at the concentrations observed. Alongside the nano-diamonds, they documented elevated concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare in Earth's crust but common in cosmic objects as well as spherules. Tiny glassy beads formed when rock is instantly vaporized and then resolidifies as it falls back through the atmosphere. A widespread layer of carbon-rich material consistent with simultaneous large-scale wildfires burning across multiple continents appears in the same stratigraphic layer at sites separated by thousands of miles. The pattern Firestone's team argued it was consistent with one or more extraterrestrial impacts capable of triggering not only immediate local destruction, but also the kind of atmospheric and hydrological disruption that could initiate a prolonged global cold period. The paper generated immediate controversy and has remained contested ever since, with subsequent studies both supporting and challenging its findings. No confirmed impact crater from this period has been definitively identified. Though a large crater discovered beneath the Greenland ice sheet in 2018, named the Hiawatha crater, has been proposed by some researchers as a candidate with dating that remains a matter of active debate. This is the foundation on which Graham Hancock builds, not the meltwater hypothesis which produces a cold period, but no catastrophe in any visceral sense. No sudden fear, no physical destruction, no single terrible moment, but the impact hypothesis which produces all of these things simultaneously and at a scale that would have been experienced by any human population within range as something close to the end of the world. Hancock was drawn to Firestone's work, early recognizing in it a mechanism that could explain phenomena he had been investigating for years. The rapid extinction of Ice Age megafauna across North America, including mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, and American horses, all of which disappear from the fossil record paused at approximately this time. The flood myths that appear in the oral traditions and written literature of cultures on every inhabited continent describing in strikingly similar terms a catastrophic inundation from which only a small number of survivors escaped, and the clustering of early civilization's apparent beginnings. Agriculture settled villages, monumental construction in the immediate aftermath of the Younger Dryas as if something had been lost and was being slowly, painfully rebuilt. For Hancock, this clustering is not coincidental, and it is not adequately explained by environmental pressure alone. He looks at the sudden emergence of organized complexity in multiple locations around the world within a relatively narrow window, following the end of the cold period, and sees not independent parallel development, but convergence, the spreading of knowledge from a single source. That source in his model was a civilization that existed before the catastrophe, a society that had developed over many generations, sophisticated understanding of astronomy, navigation, and monumental engineering. And that was very nearly destroyed when the comet struck. Nearly, but not entirely. Survivors remained, and those survivors carrying knowledge, but no longer possessing the physical infrastructure of the civilization that had generated it, began to appear in different parts of the world. Teachers without a school, architects without a city, astronomers without an observatory, and to work alongside the hunter-gatherer communities they encountered, sharing what they knew, contributing to the construction of the monuments that mark the beginning of our recorded story. That transmission of knowledge, Hancock believes, left traces in stone across multiple continents, and one of the clearest traces of all sits on a limestone hilltop in southeastern Turkey, encoded in the carvings of a site whose builders, by all conventional accounts, should not have known what the carvings apparently contain. The question of what those builders actually knew, and where that knowledge might have come from, opens through the Younger Dryas itself, through the cold and the dark and the long silence after the ice returned. We follow it there now, the magicians of the gods. The survivors of a catastrophe do not arrive with monuments, they arrive with memory. Whatever they once built, whatever cities or observatories or harbours define the civilization they came from, those things are gone, consumed by fire, drowned beneath rising water, buried under the accumulated weight of a world that reorganized itself without asking permission. What survives a catastrophe of sufficient scale is not infrastructure. It is knowledge held in human minds, passed from one person to the next in the only medium that requires no raw material and no fixed location language. Story, demonstration, and the slow, patient act of teaching someone else to do what you already know how to do. This is the form in which Graham Hancock imagines the survivors of his proposed Ice Age civilization moving through the world after the comet struck. Not as conquerors, not as colonizers, but as carriers of a tradition that no longer had a home. He calls them, borrowing a phrase from the mythologies, he has spent decades collecting the magicians of the gods. The title is deliberately chosen. In the oral traditions of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, a recurring figure appears in the stories told about the time just after the Great Flood. The Great Darkness, the Great Cold, the precise catastrophe varies with the teller, but the figure is remarkably consistent. A stranger arrives. He comes from the direction of the water or from a distant land now lost. He is sometimes described as bearded, which in the context of ancient Mesoamerica or coastal Peru would have marked him immediately as foreign. He teaches, he demonstrates the planting of crops, the reading of stars, the laying of foundation stones, the alignment of structures with celestial bodies whose cycles he understands in precise mathematical terms. And then, having passed on what he knows, he departs or dies or is absorbed into the mythology of the people he taught, becoming a god, where once he was only a man. Hancock traces these figures across multiple traditions. Quetzalcoatl among the Aztec Viracocha, in the Andes Osiris, in the earliest Egyptian accounts the 7 sages of Mesopotamian myth, who are said to have brought civilization to humanity from the sea. He does not argue that these figures are literally the same person, or that they represent extraterrestrial visitors, or that any supernatural explanation is required. His argument is considerably simpler, and in its own way more unsettling, that these stories are memories, distorted by time, elaborated by the cultures that received and transmitted them, translated across languages and generations until the original events are barely visible beneath the mythological surface, but memories nonetheless of real people who arrived in real places and taught real skills to real communities, and are still reeling from a catastrophe so severe that it had restructured the physical world around them. The detail that anchors this argument most firmly in Hancock's work is not mythological, but geographical. During the last ice age, sea levels were roughly 120 metres lower than they are today. The continental shelves that are now submerged beneath shallow coastal seas were dry land, in many cases exceptionally productive land with access to both marine and terrestrial food sources, temperate climates moderated by proximity to water, and the kind of environmental richness that tends to attract and sustain dense human populations. The Sole Shelf connecting Australia to New Guinea, the Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia, the coastal plains of the Indian subcontinent's western edge, the Atlantic Shelf of the northwestern Europe. All of these were exposed and habitable during the Ice Age, and are now beneath the ocean. If any sophisticated civilization existed during that period, Hancock argues it would logically have been coastal, and when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, a process that was neither gradual nor uniform, but punctuated by dramatic flood pulses as ice dams failed and glacial lakes discharged catastrophically, that coastal civilization would have been progressively inundated, its physical remains swallowed by water that is now too deep in most places for conventional archaeological survey. We have explored by most estimates less than 20% of the ocean floor in any meaningful detail. What lies beneath the rest is for now beyond our reach. This is where the argument becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, and where mainstream archaeology and Hancock's framework part ways most sharply. The absence of physical evidence for an Ice Age civilization is, in the conventional scientific framework, strong evidence against its existence. We have surveyed enough of the world's surface, excavated enough sites, analysed enough sediment cores and genetic records that an organised civilization of any significant scale would be expected to have left some detectable trace trade goods appearing in distant deposit, genetic signatures of population movement, technological innovations diffusing outward from a centre. None of these signals appear in the Ice Age record in the pattern Hancock's theory would predict. What appears instead is consistent with what we already know. Hunter-gatherer populations adapted to cold conditions, living in small mobile groups, leaving behind stone tools, hearths, and occasionally remarkable art, but no cities, no agriculture, no evidence of the organisational complexity that civilization requires. And yet Göbekli Tepe sits at the edge of this argument like a stone that will not quite fit the wall. Not because it proves Hancock's theory, it does not, and claiming otherwise would be a misrepresentation of what the evidence actually shows, but because it demonstrates with physical certainty that the capabilities we assumed hunter-gatherers lacked were in fact present. The coordination, the engineering knowledge, the sustained labour across decades, the sophisticated symbolic system, all of it existed in at least one place at least 11,000 years ago in people who, by the old model, should not have been capable of any of it. Whether that capability was indigenous, grown slowly from within the hunter-gatherer communities of Upper Mesopotamia, or whether it arrived from somewhere else carried by people whose own civilization is no longer visible in the record, is precisely the question that the stones of Gobekli Tepe raise and decline to answer. The skeptics have a great deal to say about that silence, and their arguments deserve more than a passing acknowledgement. What the record actually shows. A quiet line in an academic paper published in 2013 by a team of archaeologists working across multiple Neolithic sites in the region makes a point that is easy to overlook in the broader noise of the Hancock debate. The paper notes that the T-shaped pillar formed the distinctive architectural element that gives Göbekli Tepe much of its visual drama does not appear suddenly and without precedent at the site. Earlier, simpler versions of the same form have been identified at Neveluchori, the site Klaus Schmidt worked before the Ataturk Dam flooded the valley, and at Djerf El Ahmar in northern Syria, and at several other pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the region. The style did not arrive from outside. It developed incrementally within a local tradition of stoneworking and monumental construction that archaeologists can trace through a sequence of sites spanning centuries. Each step in that sequence is modest. None of them individually seems to require an extraordinary explanation, and then Göbekli Tepe appears at the end of the sequence vastly more ambitious than what came before, but not in this reading disconnected from it. It is the culmination of a local tradition, not the introduction of a foreign one. That detail is small, but it matters because it is precisely the kind of contextual continuity that Hancock's framework intends not to emphasize. This is the first and perhaps most fundamental objection that mainstream archaeology raises against the lost civilization hypothesis as applied to Göbekli Tepe. The site is not anomalous within its regional context. It is exceptional. Certainly the most dramatic and sophisticated expression of a Neolithic monumental tradition that was already in development, but exceptional is not the same as inexplicable. Archaeologists who have worked at the site and at related sites across the Fertile Crescent point to the flint tool assemblages found at Göbekli Tepe, which are consistent with local knapping traditions, not with any introduced technology. They point to the artistic conventions of the carvings which show clear stylistic connections to the broader Natufian, early Neolithic artistic vocabulary of the Levant. They point to the animal species depicted, all of which are native to the immediate region hunted by the communities who built and used the site. Everything in the material record, they argue, points to local people doing local things with local knowledge accumulated over many generations. The tools of Occam's razor applied here cut cleanly. If the evidence is consistent with indigenous development, there is no methodological justification for invoking external sources. The second major objection concerns the astronomical interpretation of Pillar 43 specifically, and it is worth spending time with, because it is more technically nuanced than it first appears. The argument that the carvings on the vulture stone encode the position of the sun against a specific constellation background at a specific moment in the past requires accepting several independent assumptions simultaneously that the large bird represents Sagittarius rather than Cygnus or some other grouping, that the circular disk represents the sun rather than the moon, a ceremonial object or a purely abstract symbol, that the scorpion corresponds to Scorpius as defined by our modern constellation boundaries rather than some other grouping entirely, and that the builders of Göbekli Tepe conceived of the night sky using something approximating our own system of stellar groupings. That last assumption is the most problematic. Constellation systems are cultural constructs. The groupings we recognize today descend from ancient Mesopotamian and Greek traditions that were codified thousands of years after Göbekli Tepe was built and buried. Different cultures at different times have divided the sky in radically different ways. The same stars that form Orion to a Western observer are part of entirely different figures in Chinese, Aboriginal, Australian, and indigenous American astronomical traditions. To assume that hunter-gatherers in pre-pottery Neolithic Anatolia looked at the sky and saw the same patterns we see is an assumption that requires evidence, and that evidence does not currently exist. It may be correct. It may be that certain prominent star groupings are recognized consistently across cultures because the patterns are genuinely striking, but it cannot be taken as given. And when the interpretation of an entire theory rests on an assumption that cannot be verified, the interpretation inherits all of the assumption's uncertainty. Jens Notroff, an archaeologist who has worked at Göbekli Tepe since 2006, has made a further point that is uncomfortable for the astronomical reading the selective attention it requires. Pillar 43 includes a snake that does not correspond to any constellation in the proposed Scorpius-Sagittarius region of the sky. The headless human figure interpreted by Hancock as representing death or catastrophe also carries anatomical dance details, specifically the erect phallus mentioned in archaeological reports that are difficult to reconcile with a scene of destruction and loss. A more internally consistent reading of the figure might involve fertility regeneration, or some aspect of Neolithic symbolic life that we simply do not understand well enough to interpret confidently. Notroff's broader point is that focusing so intensely on Pillar 43, while treating the rest of the site's carvings as secondary, produces a distorted picture. There are dozens of elaborately decorated pillars at Göbekli Tepe. Each one is different. If the site is an astronomical observatory encoding a single crucial date, why does every other pillar show a different configuration of animals and symbols, none of which map as neatly onto the proposed constellation framework? The parsimonious answer is that the carvings as a whole represent a rich mythological or symbolic system, one that we cannot fully decode because the culture that produced it left no written key, and that the apparent astronomical correspondence in Pillar 43 may be precisely what the phrase maybe implies, a possibility, not a confirmation. It may be natural, it may be chance. The discomfort is that we cannot be sure. And this is where the skeptic's position stated fairly reaches its own quiet limit. The objections to Hancock's specific interpretations are well-founded and methodologically serious. The continuity of local traditions, the unverifiable astronomical assumptions, the selective reading of evidence. These are legitimate concerns, not merely defensive reactions from an establishment protecting its territory. But the broader question those objections are meant to settle whether hunter-gatherers alone working within a purely local tradition fully account for everything at Göbekli Tepe. That question does not close as cleanly as the individual rebuttals suggest. The pattern keeps returning, the sophistication keeps exceeding what the model predicted, and less than 5% of the site has been uncovered. What the remaining 95% might show is a question that sits quietly beneath all of these arguments waiting. The burial. The enclosures were not abandoned. That distinction is small in phrasing but enormous in implication, and it is one of the most consistently overlooked aspects of Göbekli Tepe in popular accounts of the site. Abandonment leaves a particular kind of archaeological signature, a gradual thinning of activity hearths, going cold tools, left where they fell, structures deteriorating through neglect until wind and weather and the slow pressure of accumulating soil do the work of erasure. That is not what happened here. What happened here was something far more deliberate and far more strange. At some point during the life of each enclosure, after a period of use that may have spanned generations, the people who maintained the site made a decision. They gathered fill material, broken limestone fragments, flint debris, animal bones, grinding stone, soil, and they packed it into the enclosures, systematically burying the pillars up to and sometimes beyond their carved surfaces, sealing the structures beneath tons of accumulated rubble. Then they built again on top of what they had interred, beginning the cycle, with new enclosures, new pillars, new carvings. The burial was not destruction. The care taken to fill the enclosures evenly to preserve the pillars in an upright position beneath the fill, rather than toppling them, suggests that what was being buried was being protected rather than discarded. No culture buries what it considers worthless. The act of interment in human practice across virtually every context we can examine carries meaning. Bodies are buried. Sacred objects are buried. Things that matter are placed in the earth with intention because the earth is understood as a medium of preservation rather than disposal. When the builders of Göbekli Tepe filled their enclosures with rubble, they were almost certainly not erasing something they had finished with. They were in some framework of belief we cannot directly access, doing something to it, sealing it, consecrating it, completing a cycle that required the structure to pass from active use into a different kind of existence. Whether that framework involved beliefs about death and renewal, about the relationship between what is buried and what grows above the burial, about cyclical time, and the necessity of ending one phase before another can begin. All of this is inference drawn from the practice itself, and from loose comparison with other cultures where burial carries similar weight. The builders left no explanation, only the act. What gives this practice its particular resonance in the context of Hancock's theory is the scale and repetition. This was not done once. Across multiple enclosures spanning a period of more than 1,000 years, the same pattern was enacted. Build again. Whatever drove the initial decision to bury the first enclosure was apparently compelling enough that it became a template, a practice transmitted across generations as a thing that was simply done the correct way to complete a structure whose time had passed. The transmission of that practice across centuries implies a continuity of institutional memory, a community that maintained not just the physical site but the conceptual framework that gave the burial its meaning. And maintaining that kind of continuity across generations without writing requires exactly the kind of organised social structure that the old model said hunter-gatherers did not possess. Here, the unique anchor of this chapter sits quietly among the fill material packed into the enclosures archaeologists have recovered fragments of broken pillar. Not whole pillars or pillars toppled by structural failure, but deliberate fragments, pieces of carved stone that appear to have been broken before burial, as if certain pillars were intentionally dismantled as part of the closing ritual. Some of these fragments bear portions of the same animal reliefs found on the intact pillars split through mid-figure, the carved surface preserved in the fill around them. The image of a craftsperson carefully breaking a stone they once carefully carved, fracturing the fox, the snake, the outstretched bird, and then placing those pieces into the earth alongside the intact structure, carries a weight that is difficult to articulate and impossible to fully explain. It suggests a relationship with these objects that goes beyond their function as architectural elements, a belief that the carved figures on the stone had a kind of life that needed to be properly concluded rather than simply left behind. That pattern recurs in other Neolithic contexts across the region, and it is worth noting because it argues against the idea that Göbekli Tepe was an isolated experiment with no cultural continuity forward or backward. At Çatalhöyük, the later Neolithic settlement where Ian Hodder has conducted extensive excavations, buildings were also ritually closed at the end of their use, lives, plastered walls, stripped objects placed in deliberate arrangements before the structure was filled and built over. The specific practices differ, but the underlying logic of ceremonial closure of treating architecture as something with a life cycle requiring formal conclusion connects these sites across the centuries that separate them. Göbekli Tepe does not stand alone in a void of inexplicable sophistication. It stands at the beginning of a tradition, one of the earliest expressions of a set of beliefs about place structure and the proper relationship between the living and what they build that would continue to develop and evolve across the next several thousand years of Neolithic culture in this region. What that tradition cannot tell us, because it encoded its meanings in practice rather than in words, is whether the people who buried the enclosures believed they were preserving something for the future, sealing knowledge against a world they feared might forget it, or whether the burial was purely liturgical, the correct ending to a sacred story repeated because repetition was itself the point. Both readings are possible, neither can be confirmed. And in that gap between what the stones show and what they mean, the larger questions about Göbekli Tepe continue to breathe. The agricultural revolution, and what Göbekli Tepe may have had to do with starting it, is where the next layer opens. The buried ones. There is a technical term in archaeology for what the builders of Göbekli Tepe did to their own enclosures' intentional backfill. The phrase is clinical precise and does almost nothing to convey the strangeness of the act it describes. At some point in the life of each enclosure, not after it collapsed, not after its pillars fell, not after the community that built it dispersed or disappeared, the people who used the site deliberately filled it in. They carried rubble, soil, broken stone and animal bone into the circular space they had spent years constructing, and packed it down until the pillars were buried, the carved surfaces hidden, the floor covered. Then in some cases they built a new enclosure on top of the old one, and began again. The process was repeated across multiple generations of construction spanning at least 1,300 years, producing the layered tell that Schmidt recognized in 1994 as something other than a medieval cemetery. Each buried enclosure is a deliberate act of preservation, or concealment, or consecration, or conclusion, and the distinction between those possibilities matters enormously for how we understand what this place was. The question of why they buried what they built is one of the site's most persistent and least resolved mysteries. Several interpretations have been proposed, none of them fully satisfying, each of them illuminating a different facet of the problem. One possibility is that the burial was itself ritualistic, that the enclosures were considered to have a finite period of sacred use, after which they needed to be closed and sealed in a manner analogous to burial of the dead, with the same care and intentionality that would accompany interring a person of significance. The analogy is not forced. Many cultures treat sacred spaces as living entities with life cycles, and the closing of a temple or ceremonial site through deliberate infilling is attested in other archaeological contexts, though rarely at this scale or with this consistency. A second possibility is practical, that the weight of the fill material helps stabilize the standing pillars against seismic movement or structural failure, effectively creating a kind of engineered mound that protected the stones from the forces most likely to topple them over long periods of time. This explanation has some structural merit, but it does not account for why new enclosures were then built on top of the filled ones, rather than simply maintaining the existing structures. A third possibility, and the one that carries the most weight in Hancock's interpretive framework, is that the burial was intentional preservation, that the people who built Göbekli Tepe understood on some level that what they were creating needed to outlast not just their own generation, but many generations to come, and that burying the structures beneath protective fill was the most reliable method available to them for ensuring that survival. This reading requires attributing to the builders a kind of long-range thinking that we do not typically associate with hunter-gatherer communities, though. Göbekli Tepe has already demonstrated that many of our assumptions about hunter-gatherer, cognitive and organizational horizons require revision. The deliberate burial preserved the pillars remarkably well. The carved surfaces that emerged from Schmidt's excavations were crisp, detailed, and structurally intact after 11,000 years beneath the earth, far better preserved than comparable stonework left exposed to weathering. Whether that outcome was anticipated by the builders or simply resulted from their actions cannot be determined, but the result is undeniable. What they buried survived. What makes the intentional backfill particularly interesting in the context of the broader debate is what was included in the fill material. The rubble packed around and above the pillars is not sterile. It contains enormous quantities of animal bone, the same species represented in the carvings, primarily gazelle, wild cattle, and wild boar, as well as flint tools, grinding stones, and occasionally worked stone fragments. This fill material is, in other words, the debris of feasting and activity, the accumulated byproduct of whatever gatherings took place at the site. Its presence in the backfill suggests that the burial was not performed hastily, or by strangers unfamiliar with the site, but by the same communities that had been using it. People who brought with them the refuse of their own ritual life and incorporated it into the act of sealing the enclosure. There is something in that image that resists easy analysis, a community burying its own temple with the bones of its own feasts, pressing the evidence of its own gatherings into the earth around the sacred stones as a kind of offering or record or farewell. Beneath the tell that still covers the majority of Göbekli Tepe geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry have revealed the outlines of structures not yet excavated, circular and oval anomalies consistent with additional enclosures distributed across an area significantly larger than the current excavation footprint. Estimates suggest there may be 16 or more additional enclosures buried beneath the surface, each potentially containing its own pillars, its own carvings, its own configuration of imagery, and architecture. The four enclosures designated A through D, which have generated the entire public conversation about the site, represent a small fraction of what is there. This is worth pausing with for a moment, because it means that every theory currently applied to Göbekli Tepe, every interpretation of its purpose, its builders, its astronomical significance, its relationship to the emergence of agriculture is based on less than 5% of the available evidence. The scholars who argue for indigenous development and the researchers who argue for encoded astronomical knowledge and the theorists who argue for external influence are all in a precise and literal sense working in the dark. The majority of Göbekli Tepe has never been seen by modern eyes. Each new enclosure revealed by excavation has introduced elements that complicate the existing interpretive frameworks in different ways: new animal species not previously represented in the carvings, new arrangements of the central pillar, pairs, new abstract symbols alongside the familiar H shapes and crescents. The site is not a single statement, but an accumulating conversation conducted over more than a millennium by communities whose relationship to this hilltop clearly evolved and changed over time, even as certain core elements remained consistent. What changed and what stayed the same, and why these are questions that the unexcavated portions of the tell may eventually begin to answer. For now, they wait beneath the surface, sealed by the same deliberate hands that built them, holding whatever they hold in the cool limestone dark. What was buried alongside the stones? What knowledge? What warning? What memory is the question that leads us next toward the figure who has made it his life's work to ask it? The man who kept asking, what does it take to spend 30 years asking a question that the institutions around you have already decided is not worth asking? Not with anger, not with the performative defiance of someone who enjoys the role of outsider, but with the quiet, methodical persistence of someone who genuinely believes. The question matters and has not yet found an answer sufficient to make him stop. Graham Hancock is a difficult figure to place precisely because he does not fit the categories most readily available for him. He is not a scientist, and he does not claim to be one. He is not an archaeologist, and the archaeological establishment has made clear repeatedly that it does not consider him one. But he is also not the credulous fantasist that his harshest critics sometimes describe, a man pattern matching ancient ruins to predetermined conclusions, while ignoring everything that complicates the picture. The realities are more interesting and more instructive than either portrait. Hancock was born in Edinburgh in 1950 and trained as a journalist. His early career was conventional by the standards of serious print journalism, foreign correspondence, economic reporting coverage of international development issues in Africa and South Asia. His 1989 book, Lords of Poverty, was a well-regarded critique of corruption and misallocated resources within international aid organisations. The kind of work that requires careful sourcing comfort with complexity and a willingness to follow an argument into uncomfortable territory regardless of whose interests it disturbs. The book was reviewed seriously, cited in policy discussions, and established Hancock as a writer capable of sustained evidenced argument on difficult subjects. This matters because it means the turn he made in the early 1990s toward ancient mysteries, alternative history, and the archaeology of possible lost civilizations was not a retreat from rigour into fantasy, but a redirection of the same journalistic instincts toward a different set of questions. Whether those instincts are sufficient preparation for evaluating archaeological evidence is a separate question and a fair one. But the caricature of Hancock as someone who never learned to think carefully does not survive contact with his actual early work. The pivot came with the Sign and the Seal in 1992, an investigation into the possible historical reality of the Ark of the Covenant and its alleged journey from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. The book combined archival research, fieldwork in Ethiopia, and a journalist's eye for narrative. It read less like a speculative text than like a particularly long and well-sourced magazine investigation. 3 years later, Fingerprint of the Gods made him internationally famous, or depending on one's perspective, internationally controversial. The argument of that book, that an advanced civilization had existed during the last ice age and been destroyed by a catastrophe, leaving only scattered survivors who seeded the later civilizations we recognize from history, was presented with the same journalistic confidence that had characterized his earlier work, but applied now to a domain where confidence of that kind is considerably harder to justify. The evidence Hancock assembled was real. The patterns he identified across disparate mythologies and architectural sites were genuinely interesting, but the interpretive leap from interesting pattern to confirmed historical reality was one that the book made more smoothly than the evidence warranted, and that gap between pattern and proof has followed Hancock's work ever since. What changed with the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse in 2022 was not the argument, but the scale of its delivery. The series covered material Hancock had been developing for 3 decades, presented it with high production values, and placed him as the sole interpretive authority visiting sites that professional archaeologists had spent careers studying. Within weeks of its release, it was among the most watched documentary series on the platform globally, a reach that no academic paper, no university lecture, no specialized archaeology publication could come close to matching. The Society for American Archaeology issued a formal public statement criticizing the series, arguing that it misrepresented the archaeological record and undermined professional research by presenting contested alternative theories as if they were suppressed truths. Individual archaeologists were more pointed in their criticism. The frustration was not merely professional wounded pride, though some of it undoubtedly was. It was also a genuine concern about epistemology, about what happens when millions of people receive their introduction to a complex archaeological site through a single interpretive lens, presented with the authority of certainty without meaningful counter-argument built into the format itself. A viewer who encounters Göbekli Tepe for the first time through ancient apocalypse learns a great deal that is accurate the age of the site, the sophistication of the carvings, the challenge it poses to conventional timelines, but learns it wrapped inside a theoretical framework that mainstream archaeology considers unsubstantiated and has no way of knowing that the framework and the facts are separable. Hancock's response to his critics has been consistent over the years, that archaeology has been wrong before, that established consensus has repeatedly failed to accommodate revolutionary evidence until that evidence became impossible to ignore, and that the dismissal of alternative theories through appeals to professional authority rather than direct engagement with the evidence is itself a form of intellectual failure. He points to Göbekli Tepe as an example of precisely this pattern, a site that overturned decades of settled consensus about the capabilities of hunter-gatherers and the origins of monumental architecture, discovered only because one archaeologist was willing to look at a limestone hilltop differently than his predecessors had. If Schmidt had accepted the 1963 survey team's conclusion that Göbekli Tepe was a Byzantine cemetery, the site would still be unexcavated. The willingness to question the established reading, Hancock argues, is not pseudoscience. It is what science is supposed to do. The argument has a certain force, and the millions of people it has reached are not simply being misled. They are being invited, however imperfectly, to think about questions that deserve thinking, about questions about how far back human complexity extends, about what we do not yet know about the relationship between catastrophe and the impulse to build something permanent enough to outlast it. Where that invitation leads, and what it means for the stones themselves, is a question the next layer of evidence begins to address. The agriculture question. There is a pattern in the soil around Göbekli Tepe that took years to fully appreciate, and that appreciation, when it came, quietly rearranged several assumptions that had seemed stable. The pattern is botanical. In the sediment layers surrounding the site and in the wider Karaksadir mountain range, a few dozen miles to the northeast, geneticists analysing the DNA of modern and ancient wheat varieties identified something unexpected. The region around Göbekli Tepe appears to sit at or very near the point of origin for einkorn wheat, one of the earliest domesticated grain crops and a foundational element of the agricultural revolution that transformed human life across the Fertile Crescent beginning around 10,000 years ago. The genetic diversity of wild einkorn in this specific area is the highest recorded anywhere in the world, which in botanical terms is a reliable indicator of a domestication event, the place where a plant's wild and cultivated lineages first diverged. The hill on which hunter-gatherers built the world's earliest known monumental temple complex sits, in other words, at the geographic heart of one of the most consequential transitions in human history. Whether that is coincidence or connection is a question that archaeobotanists, archaeologists and theorists have been working around for 2 decades without arriving at a consensus that satisfies everyone. The traditional model of the agricultural revolution, as it was taught for most of the 20th century, treated farming as a solution to a problem. Hunter-gatherers, the model held, were eventually constrained by the limits of what wild landscapes could reliably provide, particularly during periods of environmental stress. As populations grew and game became scarcer, communities began experimenting with deliberate cultivation, planting seeds near settlements, managing stands of wild grain, selectively harvesting the plants that produced the most food. Over generations, this experimentation produced domesticated varieties, permanent fields, and the settled villages that surplus food production made possible. Agriculture in this framework was a practical response to practical pressure. It came first. Everything else, villages, temples, social complexity, civilization, followed from it. Göbekli Tepe complicates this sequence in a way that is now broadly acknowledged within mainstream archaeology, even by researchers who have no sympathy for Hancock's theories. The site was built by people who were not yet farming. It required the coordination of hundreds, possibly thousands of person-days of labour over many decades. It implies the existence of social structures capable of organising and sustaining that labour across multiple generations, and it sits at the genetic origin point of one of the earliest domesticated crops. The question is not whether these facts are connected, the question is how. Klaus Schmidt, who spent more time thinking carefully about this question than anyone proposed, what has become the most widely discussed mainstream answer, that Göbekli Tepe did not result from agriculture, but may have helped produce it. The gatherings at the site, the feasts, the shared labour, the periodic convergence of dispersed communities on a single hilltop would have created conditions favourable to the intensive exploitation of wild plants, including the wild einkorn that grew in abundance in the surrounding hills. Communities processing large quantities of wild grain to feed the people assembled for construction and ceremony would have been effectively practicing proto-agriculture without necessarily intending to. The selection pressures that eventually produced domesticated wheat could have emerged as a byproduct of ritual rather than as a deliberate agricultural strategy. In this reading, the temple came first, not just before the city as Schmidt's famous formulation has it, but before the farm. The sacred space and the social organisation required to build and maintain it may have been the catalyst that drew humanity across the threshold from foraging to cultivation. Religion on this account is not a product of civilization. It is one of civilization's causes. Hancock engages with this interpretation and accepts parts of it, but pushes the logic further in a direction mainstream archaeology declines to follow. If the construction of Göbekli Tepe required social organisation sophisticated enough to coordinate large-scale labour, process wild cereals at industrial scale, and maintain a ceremonial site continuously across more than a millennium, and if that level of organisation appears to have existed before agriculture provided the surplus that was supposed to make such organisation possible, then the question of where the organisational knowledge came from becomes pressing in a new way. Hancock's answer remains consistent. It came from outside, from the survivors of a civilization that had already solved these organisational problems before the Younger Dryas struck and nearly erased them. The knowledge of how to coordinate large groups, how to plan and execute multi-generational construction projects, how to process grain efficiently and at scale. All of this in his framework was transmitted to the hunter-gatherer communities of Upper Mesopotamia by teachers who arrived in the aftermath of the catastrophe carrying a tradition that their own civilization had developed over centuries or millennia before the comet destroyed it. The agricultural evidence cuts in different directions depending on where you stand. For mainstream archaeologists, the genetic data showing Göbekli Tepe at the origin point of einkorn domestication is consistent with a purely local story communities gathering repeatedly at this site, intensifying their use of wild plants as part of the ritual economy the site required, and in doing so, inadvertently creating the conditions for domestication. No external knowledge transfer is required. The communities of the pre-pottery Neolithic were intelligent, observant, and fully capable of making the kinds of discoveries that lead to agriculture given the right circumstances, and the circumstances at Göbekli Tepe were in a very specific way exactly right. For Hancock, the same data supports a different reading that the speed and precision of the transition. The fact that domesticated einkorn appears in the archaeological record relatively rapidly after the period of Göbekli Tepe's construction, in a region where a massive ceremonial complex was already being built by apparently pre-agricultural people, suggests something more than slow, unguided experimentation. It suggests people who already understood the principles of cultivation, even if the cultivation itself had not yet been formally established, and who were creating conditions in which those principles could take root. Neither reading is provable from the current evidence alone, both are internally coherent. Both are consistent with the available data, which is itself a problem. When two competing explanations are equally consistent with the evidence cannot be used to choose between them. What would distinguish them is something the archaeological record has not yet provided a clear marker of external influence at Göbekli Tepe, some artifact or technique or genetic signal that could not have originated within the local hunter-gatherer tradition, and requires the presence of an outside source. No such marker has been identified. That absence is meaningful to mainstream archaeologists and less meaningful to Hancock, who points again to the 95% of the site still buried to the unknown coastal civilizations that sea level rise may have drowned to the structural limitations of what the archaeological record can and cannot preserve across 11,000 years. What the agriculture question ultimately reveals is not a fact about farming, but a fact about the limits of the argument itself. Both frameworks, indigenous development and external transmission, are trying to explain the same extraordinary convergence a hilltop in southeastern Turkey where hunter-gatherers built temples where the wild ancestor of wheat was domesticated, where the earliest known monumental architecture emerged, and where, according to some researchers, the sky above was recorded in stone at the precise moment a catastrophe changed the world. The convergence is real. What it means is still being negotiated. The next question is older and in some ways simpler, though its implications are anything but: the memory of water. Across more than 200 distinct cultural traditions catalogued by anthropologists, folklorists and comparative mythologists working across the 19th and 20th centuries, a story recurs with a consistency that resists easy explanation. The details vary, the names change, the geography shifts from culture to culture shaped by the landscape each tradition grew in. But the core structure of the narrative is remarkably stable. The world as it was known is destroyed by water. A small number of people survive, warned in advance by a figure of wisdom or divine messenger. Those survivors carry with them the seeds of what will come after knowledge, craft the memory of what was lost. And from that remnant a new world is built. The story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written narrative humanity has yet recovered, inscribed on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, roughly 4,000 years ago, but clearly derived from oral traditions considerably older. It appears in the Hebrew Bible's account of Noah. It appears in the Vedic traditions of the Indian subcontinent, in the Mayan Popol Vuh, in the oral traditions of the Ojibwe and the Hopi, in the mythology of ancient Greece, in the story of Deucalion, in the traditions of indigenous Australians, in accounts from coastal West Africa, in the stories of Pacific island cultures separated from one another by thousands of miles of open ocean. The flood is everywhere, and that ubiquity is either one of the most significant patterns in the entire archive of human memory, or is a coincidence so vast that it becomes its own kind of problem. Graham Hancock has spent a substantial portion of his career sitting with this pattern and refusing to accept the most commonly offered explanation for it, which is that flood myths are simply the natural product of the human experience of flooding. Floods happen everywhere. Rivers overflow, coastlines are breached, monsoons overwhelm drainage systems, storms push the sea inland. Every culture that lives near water has experienced flooding, and it would be surprising if that experience did not generate stories. The myth on this account is not a memory of a single global event, but a convergent cultural response to a universal hazard shaped over time into narrative form by the same storytelling instincts that turn every significant experience into something transmissible. This explanation is straightforward, parsimonious, and almost certainly accounts for some portion of the global flood narrative tradition. The question Hancock raises, and it is a genuine question rather than merely a rhetorical one, is whether it accounts for all of it. Because the myths are not simply about flooding. They are about a specific kind of flooding, sudden total civilization ending, arriving without warning, except to those few who are told in time, and followed not by recovery of the old world, but by the construction of an entirely new one. That specific narrative shaped catastrophic discontinuity, remnant survival, knowledge preservation, new beginning, is not the shape of a river flood or a storm surge. It is the shape of something that ended one era and began another. The younger dryas in Hancock's reading is that something, and the flood myths are its memory preserved in oral tradition across hundreds of generations, distorted and elaborated by the cultures that transmitted them, but retaining in their core structure the outline of what actually happened when the comet struck and the ice sheets melted and the sea levels rose and the world that had existed before was swallowed by water that did not recede. The coastlines where his proposed Ice Age civilization lived are now beneath the ocean. The survivors who escaped to higher ground carried their stories with them. Those stories told and retold and shaped into the mythological idiom of each culture that received them became the flood narratives that anthropologists have been collecting and comparing for over a century without arriving at a consensus about what they collectively represent. The detail that Hancock consistently returns to is not the water itself, but the survivors, specifically the figure of the wise stranger, the teacher who arrives after the flood and brings knowledge. In the Sumerian tradition, these figures are the Apkallu, the 7 sages described as beings who emerged from the sea and taught humanity the arts of civilization before the flood, and who returned after it to help rebuild. In Mesoamerican tradition, Quetzalcoatl arrives from the east bearded and fair in descriptions that would have been unmistakably foreign in the pre-Columbian world, and teaches agriculture, astronomy, and the calendar before departing with a promise to return. In the Andean tradition, Viracocha emerges from Lake Titicaca after a great deluge and performs a similar role. In early Egyptian accounts, Osiris is credited with bringing agriculture and law to a people who had neither. The figures are different in name and cultural detail, but the function they serve in each tradition is identical. They are the carriers of knowledge across the discontinuity of catastrophe. They are the bridge between what was and what came after. Mainstream scholarship has a range of responses to this pattern. Some anthropologists accept that certain flood narratives may preserve genuine memories of real inundation events, the flooding of the Black Sea Basin, around 7,600 BC, for example, or the dramatic sea level rises that followed the end of the last ice age, which would have been experienced by coastal populations as the progressive and sometimes rapid loss of habitable land. But the mainstream position stops well short of accepting a single global catastrophe as the common origin of all flood myths, and it stops far short of accepting the wise stranger figures as historical memories of survivors from a lost civilization. The comparative mythologists' answer to the convergence of flood narratives is diffusion and archetype stories spread along trade routes and migration paths, and certain narrative patterns recur across cultures because they reflect universal features of human psychology and social experience, rather than shared historical events. These are reasonable positions. They are not, however, positions that can be demonstrated to be correct with the same confidence that they are sometimes stated. The honest answer in comparative mythology, as in archaeology, is that the origins of the world's flood narratives are not fully understood, and that the evidence for any single explanatory framework is less definitive than advocates of that framework typically acknowledge. What Göbekli Tepe adds to this conversation is a physical anchor, something in stone and soil, that connects the mythological question to a real place and a real time. The site was built at the end of the Younger Dryas, in a region that sits at the centre of the Fertile Crescent by people who were simultaneously processing wild grain at an extraordinary scale and constructing enclosures of a sophistication that still resists complete explanation. The flood myths describe wise strangers teaching agriculture after a catastrophe. The agricultural revolution begins in this region immediately after the Younger Dryas ends. The coincidence of timing and geography does not prove the connection, but it gives the connection a specificity that purely mythological arguments cannot provide. You can point to it on a map. You can hold it in your hand in the form of a worked flint tool or a carved limestone surface. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was temple observatory memorial transmission point and for knowledge that arrived from somewhere else, it was real. And it was built by real people at exactly the moment the myths describe as the beginning of a new world rising from the ruins of the old one. Whether those people were responding to catastrophe or causing change, whether the knowledge encoded in the stones was local or transmitted, whether the flood myths are history or archetype, these questions do not resolve at Göbekli Tepe. They converge there, and the convergence itself is what demands our attention. What the site cannot tell us, the myths hint at. What the myths cannot prove, the site makes physical. Together they suggest something that neither alone is sufficient to establish, and that suggestion is precisely where the mystery lives. The last thing to consider is what it means to ask these questions at all, and what we do with the uncertainty when the asking is done. What the stones outlast. The excavation season at Göbekli Tepe typically ends in autumn, when the heat of the Anatolian summer has finally relented and the limestone plateau takes on the cooler, quieter quality of a place returning to itself after months of activity. The trenches are covered, the equipment is stored, the site is left as it has been left for most of the last 11,000 years to the wind and the dry grass, and the long silence of a hilltop that has already outlasted every theory yet proposed about it. There is something instructive in that seasonal rhythm, the way the site absorbs each year of careful excavation and then closes again around what has been learned, indifferent to the conclusions drawn, waiting for the next season and the next question and the next layer of stone that may confirm or complicate everything that came before. Göbekli Tepe has been patient for 11 millennia. It is not in any hurry now. What we are left with at the end of this long journey through the traces and the theories and the counter-arguments is not a resolution, but a more precisely defined uncertainty, which is, if we are honest about how knowledge actually works, a form of progress. We know things now that the 1963 survey team did not know when they looked at the broken limestone slabs on this hill and wrote Byzantine cemetery in their field notes and moved on. We know that hunter-gatherers were capable of monumental construction before agriculture, that the impulse to build sacred spaces predates the conditions we thought were necessary for building anything at all, that the transition from foraging to farming was not a simple linear progression, but a complex multi-directional process in which ritual and social organization may have played a generative rather than a derivative role. These are genuine additions to human knowledge, hard-won through decades of careful excavation and analysis, and if they stand independent of any theory about lost civilizations or comet impacts, they would be remarkable even in a world where Graham Hancock had never picked up a pen. And yet the questions Hancock raises do not disappear simply because the answers he proposes are contested. Less than 5% of the site has been excavated. The remaining enclosures, 16 or more according to geophysical survey estimates, are still sealed beneath the tell, preserved by the same deliberate burial that has kept the excavated pillars intact across 11,000 years of geological change. Each future excavation season will add to the and there is no way to know in advance whether what emerges from the next open trench will confirm the mainstream interpretation of indigenous cultural development or introduce elements that complicate it in ways that current theories are not prepared for. Archaeology has been surprised by this hill before. It may be surprised again. That possibility is not a reason to accept unsubstantiated theories, but it is a reason to hold even well-supported ones with a degree of provisional humility that the discipline at its best already practices. The rehook that runs through this entire story, the detail that refuses to settle into either available narrative cleanly, is the deliberate burial itself. A community that builds something extraordinary and then seals it carefully beneath protective fill, preserving it against time, suggests a relationship to futurity that is difficult to account for within purely practical frameworks. You do not bury what you have made with such care unless you believe it matters to someone who has not yet arrived. The act presupposes a future audience. It assumes that what is being preserved will one day be recovered and understood by people whose existence cannot be verified and whose capacities to decode the preserved message cannot be known. Whether that future audience was intended to be the next generation of the same community, building a new enclosure on top of the old one, or something further and more abstract, a civilization not yet born capable of reading. What the stones contain cannot be determined from the stones themselves, but the gesture is unmistakable. Whatever was built here was built to last. And in that aspiration, if nothing else, the builders of Göbekli Tepe succeeded beyond anything they could have measured or imagined. Graham Hancock has spent 3 decades arguing that what was built to last also contains a message that the carvings on Pillar 43 are not decoration or mythology but communication a date, and a warning encoded in the one medium that transcends the language barrier of 11,000 years. That argument may be correct, partially correct, productively wrong, or entirely mistaken. The evidence as it currently stands does not permit a more definitive assessment than that, and any voice that claims otherwise from either side of the debate is claiming more certainty than the stone support. What Hancock has undeniably done, regardless of the ultimate validity of his theories, is ensure that millions of people know this site exists and wonder about its secrets. The archaeologists who work at Göbekli Tepe, most of whom find his interpretations frustrating or worse, are excavating a site that receives global attention, research funding, and public interest in part because a journalist with a journalist's instinct for narrative made it matter to people who would otherwise never have heard of the pre-pottery Neolithic. That is a complicated legacy, but it is not a simple negative one. There is a version of intellectual honesty that looks at Göbekli Tepe and holds both of these things simultaneously, the mainstream archaeological interpretation careful and evidence-based, and remarkably revolutionary in its own right, which tells us that hunter-gatherers built temples before they built farms, and that this inversion reshapes our understanding of what drives human civilization forward. And the Hancock interpretation speculative and contested and driven by a passion for connections that mainstream archaeology declines to make, which asks whether the story begins even earlier in a civilization beneath the sea that we have not yet found the tools to excavate. Neither reading diminishes the stones, neither reading diminishes the people who shaped them. What both readings share beneath their methodological differences and their rhetorical conflicts is a recognition that what happened on this hilltop 11,000 years ago was genuinely significant enough to argue about, significant enough to excavate carefully across decades, significant enough to bring people from across the world to stand at the edge of a trench in southeastern Turkey and look down at carved limestone that has been waiting patiently and without urgency for exactly this moment of being seen. The T-shaped pillars still stand in the enclosures that have been opened. Their surfaces still carry the foxes and scorpions and vultures and abstract symbols that some researcher in some future season may finally interpret with enough contextual support to make the interpretation stick. The wind still moves across the Yermush plateau with the same dry indifference it has always had, and beneath the surface, in the cool and the dark and the preserved silence of 11,000 years of deliberate burial, the rest of Göbekli Tepe waits more pillars, more carvings, more questions pressed into stone by hands whose owners we cannot name, in a language we have not yet learned to read for an audience they could not have known would one day come looking. We have been looking now for 30 years. We are still at the beginning. The stone still weighs 50 tons. That has not changed. Whatever theories have been built around it, whatever arguments have accumulated in the decades since Klaus Schmidt crouched on this plateau and recognized something in the shape of a broken fragment, the stone itself remains indifferent to all of it. It was quarried from the limestone bedrock of this hill by hands that held flint tools and nothing else. It was moved across uneven ground by people whose names are gone, whose language is gone, whose understanding of what they were doing and why they were doing it is gone. And then it was set upright, carved with animals and symbols that meant something specific and urgent to the community that placed them there, and eventually buried carefully, deliberately beneath the earth that has kept it intact for 11,000 years. The stone does not know. It has become controversial. It simply stands in the cool of the enclosure, the same as it has always been. There is a particular kind of peace available in that fact if you let yourself rest inside it for a moment. We came here tonight with questions about who built this place, about what they knew, about whether the carvings on Pillar 43 contain a message that reaches across the millennia to find us about whether a civilization older than any in our history books once existed and was swallowed by catastrophe and water and time. We followed those questions carefully through the limestone and the bones and the grinding stones and the flood myths and the contested mathematics of precession. We listened to the researchers who believe the site is fully explicable within the framework of indigenous human development, and to the theorist who believes it is something stranger and older and more desperate than that. Neither position closed the question entirely. Neither was able to. The stones are not finished speaking, and we have not yet developed the tools to hear everything they are saying. That is not a failure. It is simply where knowledge lives most of the time, not in the clean certainty of the solved problem, but in the productive discomfort of the question that remains open after every available answer has been tried. History at its deepest layers is less like a book we are reading, and more like a landscape we are moving through in low light. Familiar shapes emerging briefly and then receding, connections suggested and then withdrawn, the full picture, always just beyond the range of what the current light allows us to see. Göbekli Tepe is one of those shapes. It has emerged from the earth into our awareness within living memory, and already it has changed the outline of what we thought we knew about ourselves. What the next season of excavation will reveal, what the unexcavated 95% of the site contains, what future tools and future minds will make of those stones that are still buried and waiting. None of that is visible from where we stand tonight, and that is not a loss. That is the nature of a story that is genuinely still unfolding. Somewhere on that hilltop in southeastern Turkey in the cool limestone dark beneath the surface of the tell, a carved pillar sits in the silence it has occupied for longer than agriculture has existed, longer than writing has existed, longer than any civilization we can name by name. Whatever it was meant to say is still pressed into its surface, patient and undiminished. Whether we are the audience its makers imagined, or whether they imagined no audience at all and simply needed to make something that would last that question, can be held lightly like a stone turned over once in the hand and then set back down. It does not need to be answered tonight. Rest now, dreamer. Let the plateau grow quiet around you, the wind moving over the dry grass in the way it has always moved, indifferent and clean. Let the questions you carried into the sears night settle into the deeper layers where understanding sometimes forms on its own slowly without effort in the manner of sediment becoming stone over time. The pillars will still be standing when you wake. The carvings will still be there holding whatever they hold. And the hill patient, as it has always been, will keep its secrets a little longer. Not unkindly, but simply because some things were made to be approached gradually in the dark, one careful step at a time. Sleep well, the stones are not going anywhere.